Before we kick off with a discussion with two mayors who are going to give their perspective, we have a polling question. A bit of fun, not least, well, as you'll see what it is in a moment. You can answer the poll on your mobile phones, either by scanning the QR code that's up there, or you go to Slido, slido.com, and enter the code #WhatWorks2022. And viewers on the live stream who are using the Chime Go link can also participate in the poll. Now, this is the question: who would you trust more, a banker, a politician, or a journalist? And I'm rooting for journalists here, given my background. But and our politicians, I presume, are rooting for themselves, but not with a great deal of hope. Our sponsors are doing quite well, though, so that's not bad. Okay, well, my profession is doing best at the moment, so maybe we'll stop the poll there before it changes in another direction. Okay, fantastic. Some the politicians are voting for themselves, many times, no doubt. So, thank you for that. Let me invite now our panel up on stage. The two politicians. I'm delighted to bring on first Jyoti Gondek, Mayor of Calgary, and Chokwe Antar Lumumba, Mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. A big round of applause. We're really, in this session, going to look at what works in cities. Cities are often seen as the great hope for delivering social progress, at least for government entities, because they are so much more proximate to people and they have more, sort of a sense of being small enough to be able to operate with agility, but not so big that they, not so small that they can't deliver at some degree of scale. So I'm interested to explore with our two mayors what the reality of that is like and how this environment of post-truth and low trust is affecting that narrative. Let me start, though, by asking each of you, any surprises in that poll?
Not so much. Yeah, that's the first time I started a panel discussion with a poll like that, so it really starts the relationship off rocky with the audience.
So they won't believe a word you say, but nonetheless...
we can walk away now.
We're going to change that.
You're used to this, though. But so tell us, maybe we'll get practical on this. So in your own situation, we've had the most stressful couple of years in terms of, you've been at the sharp end of dealing with COVID and, in your cities. I mean, how has that been, and how has this low truth, low trust environment affected your ability to respond? Start locally with the Mayor of Calgary first.
Well, it was interesting. We had a conversation about a week ago, just getting ready for this session, and asked ourselves this very question. And I would say one of the things that's been the most troubling and probably most surprising is the persistence of negativity and the persistence of polarization and the insistence of people to go to one extreme or another as we have gone through this pandemic. I had really hoped that as we started to emerge from it and things became a little bit more positive, that the polarization would go away, but I found it to be incredibly persistent. And how about your experience?
Well, my experience is the same as we discussed, about a week ago. I think that this moment has really demonstrated the fragility of our communities, just how sorely represented people are when it comes to socioeconomic dynamics, and people move at the speed of trust. And so when we fail to have sufficient health care for communities, when we fail to meet the challenges of infrastructure in my city, then the trust factor is certainly threatened in that moment.
Have you found the same? I mean, in terms of your ability to respond?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest struggles that Calgary has right now is we are a young city, and as we grow, we are starting to face some of the challenges that other cities have seen much earlier than we have, and it's this incredibly wicked problem of socioeconomic disparity that is staring us in the face right now, and it's playing out in terms of public safety, where people are asking each other, do I feel uncomfortable downtown or do I feel unsafe? And when you start to unpack that dichotomy and that question, you see that in a lot of cases, it's just things that people have never seen before. They've never seen the inequity play out, and now it's in front of them. But in other cases, it's much more severe. There are issues of persistent homelessness. There are issues of mental health and addictions that require a much different and more collaborative approach than we've ever taken before. We've been amazingly siloed in our government departments, in our social service agencies, and we're slowly starting to bring people together.
If I can tag along to that. First and foremost, Mayor, I appreciate the way that you made that comparison. Do I feel unsafe or do I feel uncomfortable? And that's a dynamic we see downtown in Jackson as well. I'm gonna steal that. The first 2 times I'm gonna give you credit. By the 3rd time, I feel like I've said it more than you, so it'll be mine. Okay?
I totally stole it from somebody else. This is great.
But
all politicians are thieves.
hence the poll.
Says the journalist.
But you know, when we talk about that issue of trust, and this is another thing we spoke about in our earlier discussion, it's not only the trust from the resident to the leadership locally, but it's also the trust factor based on the hierarchy of governance. So in Mississippi, I have to rely on resources from the governor, federal government on down to the state of Mississippi, to the city of Jackson. And what you find with residents is most people don't care how a watch works, right? They just want to be able to tell time, right? So all they know is that they're not being served sufficiently. All they know is that, the water, when they go to turn on the faucet, isn't running as it should. So all of the challenges, the lack of funding, the racial and socioeconomic issues, they're not thinking that at that time. The first person they're thinking about is, Mayor Lumumba, doesn't have my water on. And so how do you bridge that trust? How do you have those uncomfortable discussions? And I think as mayors, we have to have those uncomfortable conversations with people while we're trying to explain. Well, first, we're trying to get the water on, right? But after we get the water on, then we have to have the larger conversations about what are the challenges here? What is really ailing you? And I think that not only is it a failure to truly appreciate how we should respond to the metrics of success differently, no longer looking at, whether we're building new buildings or, whether, a new company is coming to town, and more on the lines of, what are the sustainable development goals that we're aiming to achieve in our city. And so that's where we have to get to the larger issues after we make those repairs.
Now, what did you learn about what worked in terms of things like getting people to wear masks and get vaccinated and so forth when you were on the front lines of dealing with the COVID crisis?
I think for us, it was an incredibly telling moment where, as municipalities in Canada and in this province, we've had to take a back seat at every turn. We literally don't exist unless we're called into being through provincial legislation. We're constitutionally completely absent. So as a child in a parent-child relationship, we've always had this tension with our provincial partners. And I think it really took the pandemic for us to say, that's enough. We are no longer content waiting for you to make a decision. Your waiting is costing us lives. And we stepped in and implemented a mask mandate. And we did that because we had to. And what that taught us is there's times that you just need to pick that fight or make that thing happen. And it doesn't matter if you have that geopolitical authority. Sometimes you just have to do it. That was the biggest lesson for us.
Ultimately, we were learning while we were riding the bike at the same time, and learning our way through this pandemic. And so, I think early on, I mentioned this, early on, I think that we may have addressed it with broad strokes, maybe dealt with the challenge with the sledgehammer. And as time went on, I think we learned how we could fine-tune our response in a way that was more consistent with what science was teaching us and what we were learning. The reason that I went into law and then politics is because I was horrible in science. And so, you know, I think that it is important, and what we chose to do was to rely on the expertise that really could inform us best at the time. We created a COVID task force. I think that, you know, I was able to represent to the residents of Jackson that I had people that they trusted. We had credible messengers in a sense that they could look to and say, well, if these are the people that are advising him, I believe in that. I don't know that I don't know what your circumstance was. I don't know that we ever fully got the response that we desired in terms of every person wearing a mask, but it was much improved from the moment we started. And I believe that, you know, going about it in that way enabled us to save lives. You know, for those that were cantankerous and content in not wearing the mask, you know, my message to them was, if you hate me because I'm forcing you to do this, well, I just ask that you wear the mask so that you live another day so you can hate me a little longer, right?
I mean, both of you, to what extent do you feel, and I guess this question goes to what you see as the root cause of the low trust environment that we're operating in. I mean, to what extent do you think COVID will have, you know, will prove a turning point because it, at some point, did become a, you know, return to science for some of us at least, and a recognition there are facts out there that if you go one way you live, another way you die.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I would say there are a number of factors that led to the low trust. I think the over-politicization of the issue itself, mixed messaging depending on, you know, what political ideology you align yourself with, contributed towards that. I think that, you know, in a place like Mississippi, where so many individuals don't have the health care that they need on a routine basis, we have to understand that there is a lack of representation amongst those most marginalized communities. So they don't see themselves in the physicians that are advising them. They don't see themselves in many of the people that are you know, providing the advice that is taking place. And so what COVID revealed at the end of the day, COVID didn't come to discriminate against anyone. COVID, like I said, it merely illuminated the fragility that it had already existed. And so that lack of trust has built up over time. And so that, I think that I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's just a moment that it was put in our faces in a more transparent and obvious way than ever before.
And that point about people couldn't see themselves reflected in the positions they should trust, that is something that was loud and clear from our First Nations partners as well. We had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago with Siksika Nation, and one of their members of council said, we have found that we don't have enough people in medical professions that look like us, and therefore we have trouble trusting the diagnoses that we're getting and the advice that we're getting. And the other thing that I think COVID revealed to us is we have a big political or ideological divide between, how do I say this without just saying it? You're either business friendly or you're union friendly. That's the situation we're in provincially, and you can't be both. And the situation that created is wherever unions existed, specifically in nursing and in teaching, it became a battle with the government, and it shouldn't be that way. You should be able to park those politics in a very dire situation like COVID. And we began to see that professions that were largely female-dominated were not getting the representation that they needed. So there was all kinds of disparity that became clear during the pandemic.
So what are you both doing about rebuilding trust? And, you know, is city government the right or the best level at which we can do that in restoring faith in politics?
I took the last one.
Yeah.
I would say one of the biggest things that we need to do as politicians writ large, it doesn't matter which jurisdiction you represent, you need to be real. And if we're not having real conversations and we're not talking about how we are processing things and how we are making evidence-based decisions and how world events are impacting us, no one's going to believe us. I would say last week was one of the toughest weeks on the job, and it didn't have anything to do with Calgary. You know, the school shooting in Texas was a breaking point for me personally. It had been so many days, so many weeks, so many months of so much pain and so much suffering to have that happen on top of it was crushing. It was absolutely soul crushing. And I could have put a smile on my face and just kept going and said, it's not my problem. Couldn't do it. I couldn't do it, and I articulated how I felt in that moment. And it was interesting. I didn't do it to get praise, and I didn't do it to build a base. I did it because I had to. I'm someone that writes. And when I write, I can get rid of what burdens me. And it was well received because people wanted to say those exact words and they couldn't figure out the way to do it. So let's please just be honest with each other, and as politicians, let's be real. We have feelings, you need to hear them.
If I could, you know, grab onto the last point about what took place in Texas. You know, at the start of COVID, I actually issued an executive order banning open carry in the city of Jackson. Now, this is recorded. That certainly led to some legal challenges from the state of Mississippi. And I knew that I was stretching the limits of the law that was there, or at least, you know, interpreting that law to the best of my ability to serve my residents. But the reason that I did so is because I could see what was coming, you know, in the midst of the trauma that was setting in the midst of COVID. And you know, as we talk about the work of the social progress imperative, I think when we better understand the equation that leads to the challenges, when we better look at these issues, then it is easy to make those determinations that, you know, if there's a moment where we have economic turmoil, we have, you know, emotional turmoil taking place, we have the physical effects taking place within our communities, then it is easy to make the connection, the one-to-one, that we're going to start seeing, you know, a rise in the interpersonal conflicts taking place in communities. And so that was important to do. And I think that that is why we really have to gravitate to prioritizing, you know, an index that allows us to really fine-tune our response in our work.
And how do you build on that for yourself?
One of the things that has been, it's been interesting and it's been a challenge is raising awareness of issues that are not tied to your property taxes. You know? Like, that's all anybody wants to hear from us. Like, are my property taxes going up? Are they going down? No one wants to talk about the services that go along with that. And people are reluctant to have meaningful conversations. Like, how do you have proper dialogue? How do you have a key critical conversation with somebody when we've lost the art of discourse? So I would say that declaring a climate emergency early days on council lit the world on fire for whatever reason. I mean, it wasn't attached to anything other than saying the climate crisis is real. We believe that as a city. We will be taking action. And really, we were doing exactly what the energy sector has been doing for years. Basically, we said, you know what? All of you have been doing this. We haven't kept pace. We would like to, so we're going to mirror some of your initiatives. But it became a war on the energy sector, and that's not what it was intended to be. So we just spend so much time as municipal governments trying to do the right thing, but people want to talk about, you know, fix my pothole, and, you know, don't tell me about anything else. But we have more to do than just that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, how do you avoid getting into this polarization? Because, I mean, it seems to me that that is the mode we're in at the moment, is that there's a lot of othering of anyone that's slightly different. There's a natural gravitation towards the extremes of any argument. So, you know, we do face something like climate change. There is a serious conversation to be had about what a just transition is, because you can't just shut everything down overnight. Certainly a country like Canada, this part of Canada with so much oil, you know, you've got to have something to say to the industry that is producing that. And how do you have a constructive conversation without it going into just a shouting match?
I mean, when it comes to that particular example, we've had very meaningful conversations as a local city council and administration with the energy sector. We're hosting the World Petroleum Congress next year. I went down to Houston to do the baton exchange between mayors, and my message has been consistent over time. The energy sector has been evolving in this province over time. It has been transitioning over time. And now is the time for a more radical transformation, and the energy sector itself is leading that because they know what they need to do. So if that's the message I'm delivering hand in hand with leaders from the sector, perhaps it'll get picked up by all sides. But if we don't deliver that message together, it won't get out there.
So, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, ultimately, it's the manner in which you approach your discussions. I think that you have to do so through operational unity, focusing more on the common ends and objectives than your differences. I think at the heart of any issue of change amongst political leadership or community, you find that people aren't actually against change. What people are afraid of is loss, right? And so it's a matter of how you construct a narrative around our shared gain as opposed to, anyone losing in this particular equation. It becomes difficult. Sometimes that is easier said than done, depending on the issue. But that is the way that you have to approach the conversation.
Great. I'd like to bring the audience in with any questions that people have, and also, do we have anything from online that we want to share? Not yet. Does anyone have a question for either of the mayors or both of the mayors about?
Not all at one time.
Not all at once, yeah, please.
They're racing to the mics.
Yeah, over here, and please, there's a mic that's going to come to you, so if you could wait for that so that we can get it on the live stream, and also please say who you are.
Rahim Sajan, I'm from Calgary. Mayor Lumumba, you just said something really intriguing. How do we communicate to people what you are going to gain rather than what you're going to lose? In complex times, can you speak more about an example of how you were able to sort of shed light on that, to remove to focus on the signal and not the noise type of thing?
Yeah, one example now this is prior to the COVID experience. But one of the things that I was challenged with maybe a month into taking office my first term was the potential state takeover of our school district. And that certainly raised a lot of concern within community. There were people on the various poles of that particular challenge, some believing that it should be taken over, some having less trust in the state. And so it went through the process of going through the State Board of Education, where they passed, a decision to take over the school district, and even the accreditation board. And it was all but the governor's signature away from being taken over. The Tea Party governor, might I add, right? And I have been considered the radical mayor, right? And so if people were taking bets, they certainly would have imagined that our school district was going to be taken over. But I had a discussion with the governor, and out of that discussion, I shared with him that when state takeovers have taken place, that they have been unsuccessful, not only in the state of Mississippi, but throughout the United States. It's hard to find an example of a successful one, and even the most successful ones, there still are challenges as you go through the transition of putting it back within local control. And so I admitted to the governor that I felt that there was certainly an opportunity to grow and improve, but that we had to consider whether we were actually creating a greater problem than we were solving. And so what he said was he felt stretched, right? He felt that he wished he had, a third option, right? And so that conversation, approaching it based on, what his concerns were, approaching it based on, how it might look from the state standpoint with the takeover and how they may be judged in the process. Looking at even some economic investment that had taken place in the city for some of his friends and how that would have been impacted. That's the way that I approached the conversation. And so when he said he wished he had a third way, that is when we went to the office and we created a third option, right? We created a Better Together Commission, which allowed not only the city to lean in more in terms of the school district, but we brought in a partner in the Kellogg Foundation. We also allowed the state to play a role in it. And the most important partner was the community. We knocked on 60,000 doors. We had community meetings in every ward in our city. We made certain that we were able to ascertain the gap between where the district was and where the dreams and aspirations of our parents and our students would have the district to be. And all working together, we were able to generate a different view and a different team, ultimately, that was able to approach, and we saw immediate success. We were able to get new leadership for the school district and attack many of those challenges. And so that is, the example that immediately comes to mind.
Zachary.
Hi there. I'm Zachary Carabell. I'm the founder of the Progress Network. Given that we began on mass and how much all of us are really still having deep and an active passion to keep having the discussion about mass, given how enjoyable those discussions have been over the past few years, I thought I would continue that discussion. The New York Times today, David Leonhardt, in the upshot, talked about interviewed a bunch of public health officials, Michael Osterholm, who had been on Biden's transition task force on COVID responses, so people who are not in any way inimical to the effort of public health, basically have concluded that masks work, mask mandates don't, and learning from the experience of cities and mask mandates. Hong Kong had one of the most aggressive mask mandates in the world and also one of the most intensive COVID outbreaks in the world. And I'm asking this not really for a rehash about mandates, particularly given what we didn't know when we didn't know it, but about the use of power and authority, given that there is, at a local level, both in Canada, less in Canada, certainly in the United States, an immense amount of power that accrues to local authorities in public health emergencies. And what the experiences of just because you can doesn't mean that you should, and just because you should doesn't mean that you can. So what have you learned about what does it mean to utilize authority and power in an emergency time? To what degree does the use of that have its own unintended consequences, meaning you can do it in the moment, but maybe that undermines you later on for something subsequent, so the temptation of we can do this and we have to do something can have unintended consequences. So I'm just curious for both of you thinking ahead about what these experiences have essentially taught you about power, its limits, its use, and what one might do.
I would say your question in and of itself tells you what I learned. First and foremost, being in the midst of this global pandemic really brought front and center some of the powers as mayor that I never really even considered or thought of it in that way. But in the absence of a uniform response, what we were trying to do was learn our way through the challenge. And so I think that it not only revealed that power, but it also revealed how under-resourced and how I lacked power at the same time. So both dynamics were at play in that very same moment. I would be very interested to know kind of what the research that you were just speaking of talked about masks working, but mask mandates not working. My experience was not only was I taking the advice of our COVID task force, but I was also listening to not only community members, but business owners who were concerned with how you operate an economy in the presence of COVID. And so many of them wanted the cover of the mayor making the mandate so that they could enforce it in their business, maybe resist conflict that may take place amongst some of their loyal customers. And so I would certainly tell you this. I think that there were things that we did that were absolutely necessary, and I believe that it saved lives. I think in hindsight, there are probably some things that may have been an overreach and may not have been as necessary in that moment. But I think having the politicization of the issue, having a lack of a uniform response, I think that's where that honesty comes into play, where you tell community members, listen, everything that I'm doing is out of sincerity and fully intended to save lives. But at the same time, if there are some things that we discover weren't as necessary, then I think we transparently say, we have learned that this isn't a necessary step to take in order to make you safe.
I have 64 seconds.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
We can go a little longer.
Here's what I learned. there are times that you had to take action, whether that jurisdiction belonged to you or not. That's something I've already said. The other thing I learned is to make sure that you bring human beings back into the equation. The idea of normalizing wearing masks led us to a very successful outcome. The mandate allowed people to get comfortable wearing masks in public, and they were able to say, wow, you know, city council says I have to. And we found that a lot of organizations, particularly community-based organizations, rec centers, gyms, were able to say, well, you have to wear a mask because city council said so. And that's how they kept themselves safe. But the more people wore masks and the more people understood that it's not an anomaly to wear one, in fact, it's okay, no one's going to judge you for it, the more comfortable they became. And when our mandate lifted, and right, we lost the ability, to your point, we lost the ability, the power to do anything about it because that part of the legislation was surgically removed. So we had to rely on people being comfortable. And the fact that human behavior is such that if you see others do it and you think it's normalized, it's okay. So I went back to my sociological leanings to say, you can get a society to do something without a mandate as long as you first take that risk of pushing the mandate and explaining why you're doing it.
So we're almost out of time, and I just wanted to finish by asking each of you to peer ahead over the next year, which I can't imagine is an easy task given what surprises we've had in the last few years. And just to ask yourself, from the perspective of building trust in politics and government again, whether it be at the level of your individual city or maybe your nation, what do you think is the biggest opportunity or threat that we face in terms of which way this is going to go?
Well, I'll say, you know, as we think globally about some of the greatest organizers of our time, right? You know, King, Medgar Evers in Mississippi. I think while we revere them, I think that the greatest organizer of all time is oppression. And given the right opportunity to use that and educate and build off of it, there are moments that we can mobilize. And one of my principal objectives in my leadership is how do we democratize power? How do we not only educate communities so that they have a deeper understanding of why they are challenged, why they resemble other communities that suffer from the same challenges that they suffer from, but how are they empowered to build the solutions and build the institutions that better serve them?
I would go back to that idea of normalization. If you see yourself reflected in your government, you trust a bit more. And I would say that our city council right now is probably more reflective of our population than we ever have been in the past. If we normalize the fact that people like the mayor and I can sit here and be mayors of major cities, that makes people feel that they're well represented. So I would say, you know, in addition to your point about oppression, if people feel there's hope, that will drive them to be politically active. And it might reduce our apathy and increase the idea that people have confidence that their vote matters. So I think it's a combination of the two things.
Great. Well, I mean, I think the optimism and spirit of your closing remarks in particular were more optimistic than anything I heard last week in Davos. So we're off to a very good start. So thank you.
Can we do the poll again?
Yeah.
Do you like us now?
Let's do it. Let's do it now.
I don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much to both mayors. And